Hey, Pickens View. I hope everyone is well. Pastor Sherry here. We're going to throw a few devotionals at you over the next week or so while we're all stuck in the house, hoping to give you some encouragement. And this week it's my turn. So I want to talk to you today about waiting. We're in this strange period of waiting in our nation. We're waiting for the curve to flatten and the spread of the disease or virus to cease. And we're waiting to get back to normal. I know for a lot of you, normal looks like going to work and sending your kids to school or being able to be outside of your home for extended periods of time during the day. And right now, our temporary normal is something very different from that. We are stuck at home. Usually home is a nice, familiar place, but right now home almost seems like, I don't know, not prison, but confinement, certainly confinement. And it's not something we're used to or we're very welcoming of in this setting, but it's something that we're having to deal with. But while we wait for things to return to normal, I think it's very important for us to kind of take stock of the things that we've taken for granted, that we've taken advantage of in our lives, our comfort and our convenience are things that I think we do take for granted sometimes. So I think maybe this will give us a time to refocus and recalibrate and to determine what is really and truly important. There are a lot of things to think of and to consider while we wait. The scripture that we're going to look at today is Luke chapter 8, verses 26 through 56. We won't read all 30 verses because this is just supposed to be a short devotional. If I read 30 verses and preached deeply on 30 verses, it would be a sermon and then some, probably. But I won't do that to you because it's a devotional. These 30 verses, though, they tell three very different stories. And they're stories of people who had to wait for something. There's the demon-possessed man who was freed from that demonic possession. There's the story of Jairus, the synagogue leader whose daughter was dying. And then there's the story of the woman who bled for 12 years. So all of these stories, one common element they have is that they were required to wait for something. And the first story of waiting that we look at is the story of the man who was possessed by the demons. And this comes from verses 26 through 39 of Luke chapter 8. He's living in the tombs. He's been possessed by demons for years. It says in verse 27, it says, "For a long time this man had not worn clothes or lived in a house, but lived in the tombs." So for a long time, he had waited for some type of healing or deliverance from this situation. He's got no home that we're told. We don't know if he had any family or friends, but it might seem logical that either he didn't or they had become frustrated with the situation and had maybe deserted him or just didn't come around because they didn't know how to approach the situation. He was naked. And in the times that when he was possibly in his right mind, when the demons weren't tormenting him, he was probably very afraid. So in this time, he could do nothing but wait. Either wait for the demons to get bored with tormenting him and move on to someone else, or wait for someone to talk to maybe. And since he was living in the tombs already, he may have just been waiting to die. But once Jesus came along and healed him and delivered him from this period of waiting, he had a story to tell. And we don't know what he might have told people about his time living in the tombs and Jesus rescuing him from that way of life. But it is likely that he included the detail of waiting and how that period of time made him feel desperate and hopeless. And then in Luke 8:40 through 56, we see two stories of waiting being rolled into one. There's again Jairus, the synagogue leader, whose daughter was dying, and then there was the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. But they were both doing very different kinds of waiting. For Jairus, he was doing the kind of waiting that no parent ever wants to do. He according to Scripture, looked like he was waiting for the end. It says in verse 42 that she was dying. At that point in Scripture, we don't get any hope for her healing. We just see that he comes to Jesus and he's pleading at his feet for Jesus to come home with him. And as Jairus was pleading at the feet of Jesus for Jesus to come home with him to possibly heal his daughter, that hope had been interrupted. His period of waiting had been delayed. Someone else who had been waiting enters the scene, and it's the woman with the issue of blood. Verse 43 gives us an indication of the desperation she was experiencing while waiting. It says she had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. Verse 44 shows that in her waiting, she, like Jairus, found hope and faith in Jesus. It says she came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. But unlike Jairus, she asked nothing of Jesus. She simply touched him and was healed. So what happened to Jairus' daughter? The story just takes a pause right there. While Jesus was addressing the woman who had been healed, the girl unfortunately died. Jairus' waiting seemed to have ended, or had it. His waiting for her anticipated death had ended, but his waiting for Jesus had not. Jesus went on to Jairus' house after hearing of her death and promised Jairus that she would be healed. So Jesus did just that. He did what he promised. So in this chapter, we see 3 periods of waiting and 3 lives restored. But let's focus on Jesus and his reactions to the people in the stories. For the demon-possessed man, Jesus approached him. He didn't dismiss the man. He looked right at him and asked him his name. When Jairus was pleading at the feet of Jesus for his dying child and Jesus was distracted by the woman, Jesus didn't forget about Jairus, but he remained completely aware of Jairus' need. For the woman who thought that she would quietly slip in, receive healing, and then quietly slip away, Jesus noticed her. For each of these people, their time of waiting, no matter how long or short, no matter how public or private, was spent in some form of desperation. But Jesus, in their time of desperate waiting, took notice. So for us, we can look to these examples of people who waited and know that Jesus sees us too. Like the demon-possessed man, Jesus knows our name. Like Jairus, who may have thought that Jesus' attention was completely focused on someone else's suffering in his time of need, Jesus is completely aware of our trials and he has not forgotten us. Like the woman who'd been bleeding for 12 years who thought she was unnoticed, he sees us. So in this time of strange waiting, where we don't quite know what the outcome will be, know this: you are named, you are noticed, you are known. So don't lose heart, don't lose hope, and don't lose faith.